Hello, good morning everybody, and thank you very much for the extra 10 minutes, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really honoured to be here, and it's great to meet you all. And as Terry says, you know, yesterday's a pretty tough act to follow, actually, and I just hope that you'll enjoy my presentation. So, when I saw that I was in a session with the theme of what future for coral reefs, I thought, oh, well, what future is there for coral reef dependent people? And particularly, you know, what futures are viable, desirable, and sustainable for coral reef people going into the future? And so I hope that this talk will sort of pick up on a number of the themes that emerged yesterday from Josh's talk, Terry's talk, and a number of the talks, really about looking at these, you know, interacting kind of changes, these multiple drivers. But I'm interested really in how they interact and impact on people who are dependent on coral reefs. So, you know, the 655 million people that Pip kind of highlighted in her talk yesterday. So, to give you a little bit of the sort of context for this talk, as I said, I'm interested particularly in poor people in poor countries who are dependent on a wide range of different resources associated with coastal and marine systems, and particularly perhaps coral reefs. In this context of really rapid change, and not only rapid ecological and environmental change, but also, of course, in many places, rapid social and economic change as well. You know, the rates of kind of population movements, of kind of major shifts in livelihoods and sources of livelihoods that people are dealing with. And in looking at these multiple interacting and escalating threats, which are not only exacerbated by, but also exacerbate poverty. Okay, so very much looking at, in a way, how people negotiate and strategize and deal with these multiple changes that affect their lives. So this really just is to give a little bit of background on where I come from as a social scientist who works with people from lots of different disciplines. I have a very sort of, you know, diverse background in different aspects of social and environmental sciences. And a sort of major focus of my work has been on understanding adaptive capacity. And I've been really lucky to work with people like Josh and others from the centre on that over the years. So I kind of recognise that that's also an important sort of strand of work that informs my thinking. And I published a book last year on resilience, development and global change. And I need to acknowledge that actually I finished writing that. I wrote a lot of it sitting in JCU 2 years ago. And so I really benefited from the sort of scholarship and collegiality of people, not only at the centre, but also at CSIRO. So many of you have helped me with my thinking here. And I was trying to really kind of expand on some of the human development aspects of resilience thinking. So bringing together social ecological systems thinking with a range of sort of ideas from different disciplines like anthropology, psychology, human development, and so on. And looking at how kind of resilience is experienced, how change is experienced and negotiated by people, particularly in the context of poverty. And I developed this idea of everyday forms of resilience, which of course builds on political scientist James Scott's work, which some of the social scientists here might know, to think about, well, you know, how is kind of resilience negotiated and strategized in every day in dealing with multiple change, multiple uncertainties. And I emphasize these three different aspects of resilience. Firstly, resistance, and that was important because, over the years that I've been talking to people about how they deal with change, they talk a lot about resistance, and resistance is about how people can exert their agency, and particularly how they can confront many of the different forces and changes which they feel are being imposed on them. So those sort of external drivers that were mentioned in a number of talks yesterday. Secondly, I highlighted the role of rootedness, which again came out in some of the talks yesterday, which isn't just about place. I mean, people think of rootedness about being how you're rooted to a particular place and how you're linked and your attachment to that place, but also about how you construct quite multiple identities, particularly because we know that, people are highly mobile and they're responding to change by moving in many places. So it's not just about being rooted to one place, it's about constructing your identity and your livelihood in different contexts. And thirdly, this idea of resourcefulness, which was trying to move beyond this understanding of adaptiveness and adaptive capacity, which emphasizes assets, to look at all the other resources that people draw upon. So not only material or financial or economic assets, but also a whole range of different things to do with capabilities and the different capacities that people bring to dealing with change. So I'll kind of be picking up on those themes in this talk. But the other thing that I really want to emphasize in this is that it's actually pretty difficult as a social scientist to engage with and research the future. I mean, it's notoriously difficult to ask people about the future, about hypothetical situations and about what people think the future might bring, what it might be like. And so over the years, I've kind of started to look beyond the, I suppose, safe and the conventional tools of the social scientist, and to think about, well, what sort of techniques can we use to really engage people in discussions around the future. That's what some of my most recent work is doing, particularly with coastal people in different contexts around the world. So I'll introduce particularly two recent projects. So the first one, which some of you might be familiar with, is some work that's funded by the UK's ESPA programme, which is on ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. We've had two projects based in Kenya and Mozambique, which have been looking at basically what are the range of different well-being benefits that people in coastal social ecological systems derive from their environment. So we're using an ecosystem service and well-being lens. But one of the things that we did early on in our work in Kenya, and again, this was informed by many people in the centre's work, actually, Josh and Christina and Louise Evans and others, is that we developed a set of scenarios to be able to look at possible futures. And this slide shows how we developed representations of these narrative scenarios. And it shows 4 different scenarios, basically saying, what might the Kenyan coast look like in 15 years' time? And actually, within each of those images, there's a huge amount of detail, which is based on a lot of ecological modelling, a lot of economic modelling, and a lot of social science focus groups and survey work. So they are each, if I just go back, actually, you might see, so in the bottom right-hand corner of each image, there's a different state of the reef. There's healthy corals, less healthy corals, big fish, little fish. This is at least my sophisticated understanding as a social scientist. Some have big fish, some have small fish. But there's different types of fishing being employed. There's obviously different types of trading happening on the beach, and there's different levels of expansion of tourism. So within each image, there's an awful lot of detail, and it's based on a whole range of plausible futures that have been modelled and calibrated, and which are then discussed with different stakeholders and different publics at the coast to ask of them, well, which of these futures is desirable and why? Because what we wanted to understand is, what, not only what do people think is feasible, but what's desirable, what fits with their aspirations. And particularly, what are the kind of trade-offs that need to be negotiated in order to achieve more desirable trade-offs, and which are acceptable to people. And we developed this idea of trade-offs and this distinction between taboo and tragic trade-offs, and we published this a year or so ago in a paper led by Tim Dorr and PNAS, because what we very soon realized is that we could do a lot of fancy sort of modeling and looking at these trade-offs using these different trade-off analyses. But actually, when we sat down and discussed these with people, with different stakeholders at the coast, we realized that actually they're about trading off very different values. And so there are some values that people aren't prepared to negotiate, these sacred values. And, they might be associated with things like how you feel about equality. I mean, this was mentioned yesterday. And how you feel about protecting certain people in society. And what we found in the case of the Kenyan coast was that some futures were undesirable because the trade-offs were felt to be morally unacceptable. So sacred values such as the protection of the most vulnerable within society couldn't be traded off for profit or for, more sustainable fishery even. So in this context, people felt that it was very unfair to disadvantage the poorest and most vulnerable people, and particularly women fish traders like the woman in this photograph. So the really important sort of lesson from this work was about really trying to understand how these values are constructed and how they affect, really, what might be feasible, what might be desirable for the future. So the next example that I want to give you is actually some work that's I'm involved in at the moment, which is sort of, again, trying to investigate how people negotiate these multiple stresses and multiple changes, but using a whole range of different techniques around creative practice. And in this example, again at the coast in Kenya, so covering the same region as the work funded by ESPA, we used a type of participatory theatre called forum theatre. I'll tell you a little bit about it and show you some clips of how it works. And forum theatre is actually developed as a very kind of empowering form of community theatre. And what it seeks to do is to really try to empower people to identify the key issues for their community and to develop and identify a set of solutions and to co-create solutions around this experience of a participatory performance. So we used focus groups, we used key informant interviews, we used the conventional social science to understand what the key issues and the priorities of the community were. We devised a play, and this was working with a group called Safe Kenya, Safe Pwani, who are shown in this picture, based in Mombasa. And then we used this play to basically ask questions of the community and invited them to take on roles to talk about, the what-if questions, which, as I've said, are really difficult to ask in conventional social science methods, and then to say, what can we as a community do to address these issues? So the play that was devised was called Gavazzi, and it focuses on 3 families and 3 particular characters who really sort of exemplify the problems that are faced by rural communities in this area in coastal Kenya. So, a lot of the issues that we've been talking about, declining fisheries, changing livelihoods, extreme weather, a lack of voice, and so on. You can have a look at, there's actually a longer movie available on the internet and through my website, and we've just published a paper which sort of gives a lot of explanation and detail and discusses this whole process. But what I'd like to do is show you a few clips to explain actually what happens during this performance, and then what I think I learned from it as a social scientist involved in trying to understand people's capacity to deal with change. So this clip is going to show you a little bit about what the story is and how the story is performed. And you'll hear some of the actors from Safe Pwani explaining, so there'll be some talking heads of them explaining what's going on, and just some clips of the performance itself.
The most important thing is to make people laugh. Because if someone laughs, he or she will just get comfortable and they will listen to what you have to say.
I have a boyfriend in the play, and his character's name is Moguya. Moguya loves music and he loves to sing and he wants to become a musician. But his dad doesn't want that for him. He wants him to be a fisherman just like he is.
When your grandfather is a fisherman, then the dad was a fisherman, then definitely you have to be a fisherman.
Kazi ya uvuvi utaki utakula nini? Sasa sikiza nikwambie kwa taarifa yako, hiyo ndio kazi utakaoifanya.
Moguya, to him, he feels like fishing is not even giving them enough income. Because now, due to the bad and poor fishing methods that the community is practicing, there aren't enough fish in the ocean. So, thereby, they're forced to go deeper and deeper in search of fish.
When we go back to the community, we show the half play with the problems, and then it ends badly.
One day his father sends him out to go fishing, and they go deep and there is a storm. And he's caught up in the storm and he drowns.
Well, unfortunately, our fishermen do not have good boats. So when they go deep sea, their boats capsize and they die. Most of them do not make it.
So remember, these are the issues and the problems and the stories, the narratives that the communities have told us. This isn't a kind of story that we're imposing on them, you know, it's not outsiders' views, it's actually their perspectives around how the kind of problems that they're trying to deal with. So the next one then shows you this process of how the play stops and the audience is invited to come and take on roles and say what this person should have done or how could they have done things differently. So again, this is going to sort of capture some of the energy and participation and engagement through this process of forum theatre.
And the audience comes on stage. Now that's forum theatre. Well, there is a challenge with the women, especially the women from my community, which are Muslims, and in the rural areas or the places where we go for the shows, they're kind of shy. I think it's because they're not they're not exposed, and they're used to being number two after the men. So mostly we'll find the women are not so much outgoing unless you push them.
When we are starting, they're a bit reserved, but at the end of the day, they are coming out and give out the solution.
So it might be quite difficult for you to kind of distinguish between who the actors and who the kind of audience members are. But you'll see that there's a huge amount of kind of energy that is generated through this process. So we can look a little bit more at some of the solutions then that people suggested to address these the issues that they had identified within their community, and which you saw articulated through, partly through that little clip of the three men and their stories.
Most ladies or women would step up on stage and try to tell my dad how much child education is very important.
Mwanamke kusoma ni kupewa elimu yani. Kwa sababu kwetu vijijini wasema hawezi kuwasomesha wanawake kwa sababu wakienda mashuleni wapata mimba. Yani mtu wavunjika moyo kumsomesha mwanamke, lakini vile mlivyotuhamasisha yani baada wengine darasa la 8 watakaomaliza basi ni wengi watakaopelekwa mashuleni yani kusoma kwa wingi hususan wanawake.
Ulimwengu sasa mwaka 2021 elimu ndio urithi wa milele baba.
Mchezo wa Gavazzi ulitupa mafundisho makubwa kwamba kuelimisha mtoto wa kike umeelimisha jamii, umeelimisha familia yote.
Kulingana na ule mchezo tulivyouona, sisi kama wakazi wa Gasi, mtoto wa kike tunaona ni muhimu sana kusoma sawa sawa na mtoto wa kiume. Tusiweke ati kwa kuwa ni mtoto wa kike si muhimu, tunaona wote ni muhimu. Kwa sababu sasa tunaona mpaka kwenye mabunge wanawake wapatikana.
They really understood that they have the solution within themselves.
Kijiji chetu chadidimia hivi sasa na mwakiona. Mvua zikinyesha mafuriko yamekuwa ni mabaya. Sasa kwa hiyo mimi nawaomba tupandeni miti kwa wingi.
No one can be able to conserve the environment better than ourselves.
Hali ya kijiji chetu mafuriko yametuathiri. Ni kweli bwana chama. Nafikiri bwana Chengo, hebu nikuone. Bwana Chengo, wewe juzi tu ulipoteza shamba lako mahindi yote, migomba, au ni uongo? Kweli.
What was lacking was the opportunity of them coming together and discussing these issues as a community. I had a very hard time as a village chairman in our play, because I had the responsibility of ensuring that all the community members are brought together in case there is any issue that is affecting them.
So those of you who know this part of the Kenyan coast might actually recognize some sort of characters here. But you'll also see these sort of interesting dynamic, particularly for women who in that society, would be very difficult for them normally to speak up, especially in a sort of, mixed crowd. But actually, the whole process of taking on the role of somebody else kind of enables them to have voice in a quite unique way, actually. And again, you'll see there is sort of the men who come on stage and take over characters sort of put a hat on to kind of, to show which character they're taking on. Anyway, so this play was performed in 10 different villages, and we've also kind of developed a film. We've gone back to the villages with the film. We've followed up, and we've done a series of workshops and focus groups and things to discuss the issues that were raised and some of the solutions that were suggested. But how does it inform my work as a scholar of, change and resilience and adaptive capacity? Well, actually, they articulated some really fantastic kind of dimensions of everyday forms of resilience. So one of the key themes that came out was this need for the community to have voice and to be empowered and to be able to really take part in a democratic process and to, have their views heard, articulating precisely this idea about resistance. There was a very strong sort of sense of place that was articulated. And again, you would have seen those clips that showed how these sort of conflicting identities and this, this importance about fishing and about, being the son of a fisher and a grandson of the fisher, and actually how difficult it is for people to reinvent themselves, but at the same time, the need to find other sources of livelihood. And finally, this emphasis on capacity building, and particularly the focus on education for women. And you know, this comment that was made about how can our communities ever progress when we're only educating one half of the population? So, you know, it actually articulates and develops really nicely these ideas around everyday forms of resilience. But it also gives us some understanding of how capacities might be built to kind of deal with change. And so some very nice work from Hallie Eakin and colleagues, which distinguishes these different types of capacities. So distinguishes between generic capacity and then specific capacity, and uses this little heuristic of the 2x2 matrix. So generic capacities are what we normally associate with, you know, conventional development interventions. And we can see that the types of solutions that were being suggested are around, you know, education, around the need for community voice and local democracy, and also around, you know, livelihood diversification, you know, would fit within that conventional development paradigm. But then if we look at specific capacities where we're trying to respond to particular risks, then we can see that the sorts of suggestions for conserving and rehabilitating mangroves, adapting farming techniques and cropping patterns, and also you know, using different fishing gears and accessing different species might well be kind of much more you know, particular risk focused. But what the analysis by Eakin et al. Tells us is that actually we can't just focus on one group of capacities, because as this matrix shows, if we focus on, you know, only specific risk management, then we might well lead to sort of maladaptation. It's the classic thing that happens with climate change adaptation policies, focusing on specific risks and then, you know, missing out on a whole range of other issues. And in order to really develop, you know, more sustainable adaptation, then we need to hit this, you know, top right-hand corner of the matrix, this sweet spot where we have to build these generic as well as the specific capacities. They have to go hand in hand. And I think that's the really important lesson. So what do, you know, these sort of quite different kind of approaches to trying to understand responses to change tell us about the possible futures for coral reef people? So I want to really draw 4 conclusions from this. And the first thing, and it's not a new finding, but it's been really underscored for me, is that the impacts of these interlocking stresses and the multiple changes that are affecting people and coral reef dependent people in these systems are very, very acutely socially differentiated. And what we're finding, particularly in work that we're currently doing, looking at the impacts of the 2016 El Niño in Kenya, is that they exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. Secondly, and this underscores certainly what Josh said yesterday, and in a way approaching it from a sort of a very different perspective, culture and values really do matter in determining what actions are acceptable and which futures are desirable. And there are some things which are just completely unacceptable, and they are very often the things that external agencies are investing in. In the case of the Kenyan coast, the emphasis on banning beach stain netting was the thing that was found to be undesirable because it badly affected the women fish traders. Thirdly, that these generic and specific capacities are quite distinct, but the problem is that we need to invest in both of them to ensure future resilience and to avoid maladaptation. And finally, I think we need to kind of embrace this range of, you know, much more diverse and creative methods to engage with these things that matter to people, to engage with the kind of emotional aspects of dealing with change, and to really empower people to identify and strategize towards possible futures. Thank you very much.